and Stanford University. He began his journalism career in Little Rock at the Arkansas Gazette, where he spent 19 years until he became editor of the Arkansas Times, and in 2011 he was the senior editor, and you're still the senior editor. He's married to the Honorable Ellen Brantley, who is a retired Pulaski County judge, and they have 2 children and live in Little Rock. This is from the bio, his bio on the Arkansas Times. In addition to politics, he likes food, travel, cooking, and griping. Don't you love that? His bio also says, I'm a liberal. If you don't like it, sign on to the Arkansas blog and give me hell. So welcome, Max Brantley.
What is that? Trying to get.
Well, you.
Building a bridge. This one.
All right.
Just let me. All right.
Whenever I'm invited to one of these things, I feel a little like Admiral Stockdale. Who am I? What am I doing? Why am I here? Apart from the fact that Joyce Kennedy and I do share a hometown, and I couldn't resist her persistence in asking me to come up, and so here I am. I'm always happy to come to Fayetteville. It has a warm spot in my heart. I was going to say Fayetteville introduced me to Arkansas. That's not totally true. I had an aunt, Luna, who lived in Huddig, Arkansas, and I visited her a lot as a child. But I really got to know more about Arkansas by visiting a college friend in Fayetteville in the early 70s. And I was imbued then with what you all feel today, that there's something special about Fayetteville, and I still feel that way too. The growth has been amazing, and it's a different town, but I think some of the specialness remains, even if the Deluxe and the Shack and the Susie Wong's and Mary Maestri are gone. I'm particularly happy to speak to Democratic women, and I'm going to brag a little about how woke I am here. You know, I do think this year is reminiscent of a terrible year in Arkansas history. In 1957 or 58, really, it was when the crisis took a change, and that's when Adolphine Fletcher Terry. You know, it's funny. I had to think for a minute what her first name was, because they always called her Mrs. David D. Terry. They didn't call her Adolphine Fletcher Terry, which is who she was, of course. And she said, you know, the men have failed, and it's time for the women to step up and do something. And I've had the great good fortune to be associated with a lot of strong and productive women throughout the course of my life. My maternal grandmother was an Army nurse on the front lines in France in World War I. My paternal grandmother was one of 11 kids on a hard-scrabble watermelon farm in Ruston, Louisiana. All the girls managed to finish at Louisiana Tech and become school teachers. The boys weren't quite so bright as some of the girls were. But my grandmother made it out, and when her husband died early, she became something of an entrepreneur, made money selling fig preserves and amaryllis bulbs and pecans out of her backyard and renting rooms to roomers and getting by and sending my dad off to college at LSU. My mother worked the night shift at a Boeing plant in Seattle to pay her way through college, and then volunteered to serve in the Army in World War II and went to India, where she met my dad and violated custom a little bit. She was an officer, he was a sergeant. So they fraternized. My sister's a psychiatric social work. You've been introduced to my wife, who in addition to being a lawyer and judge is my portable hard drive, I like to say. But without her, I'd have no memory anywhere whatsoever. It's true. This is not self-deprecating humor, just the facts. And we did get engaged and to be married one weekend in Fayetteville in 1975. It's turned out pretty well. So that's that's my brag for the night. I've been writing about politics in Arkansas for 45 years now, and I I have to say, and I hope I don't disappoint you, I know less than I ever did, and I'm less certain about the landscape we now see before us. I could talk about a lot of specific races where individual Democrats hope to make some gains on the ballot from, county level up to state level. But I am a pessimist by nature. If you expect the worst, you're rarely disappointed. I'd like to predict a blue wave this year, but I'd settle for a blue ripple in Arkansas. I do know that, and you know, that there have been some really strong candidates in the past who, despite good organizations and money and good ideas, couldn't get over the top against Republicans who seem to have not much to recommend them except the R after their name. I was cheered by a note before I came here from Sarah Kane Bartlett. She wrote about how all the work she's doing in the political field and about how her husband Coy had been radicalized by hearing Steve Wommack's speech set up to make a race for JP. And I mean, I think that's the thing that moved a lot of people. One of the greatest moments of my life, I was taken off on a foreign trip the day everybody marched on Washington and Little Rock and cities across the country as a response to the Trump victory. It was a really uplifting moment. Of course, out of that came a lot of the people that are in this room tonight making an effort to make a difference, and I think that's wonderful. But radicalized as I have to inject a word of caution, and even for me, a rare note maybe of moderation. I think it's important in groups like this not to be like Fox News people in the Trump tribe. Don't be fooled that we're in an echo chamber that the whole world feels as we do, because they don't. You know that, but it's a hard place. Thanks. In the old part of Fayetteville and in Hillcrest where I live in Little Rock, it's easy to forget that the world is a very different place. My city director is a lesbian. A lesbian has just been nominated to be my next state representative. I say this because, this used to be stated an open lesbian was elected. It was like that was some terrible thing. My polling place at Pulaski Heights Presbyterian, there are even still some Presbyterians in Little Rock, defies the usual voting trends. We voted heavily for Obama. We've rejected soundly every Republican that's ever run for the 2nd District Congress in our district. We voted for abortion rights. We voted for tax increases. We voted against sexual discrimination. Steve Smith and I compared notes on which voting precinct is the most liberal in Arkansas. We run a pretty tight race, I think. But we also know that the legislature isn't formed by Hillcrest and the whole part of Fayetteville, I'm sorry to say. I came to Arkansas in 1973 to work for a paper that had been on the right side of the civil rights issue. I wanted to be part of Jimmy Carter's New South. Dale Bumpers was the governor of Arkansas. The legislature might have had 2 Republicans, 1 or 2, I think. The Arkansas Gazette was a glorious and fulfilling place to work. But the rest of the story hadn't been so happy. Dale Bumpers is gone. Republicans control just about every level of government. The Arkansas Gazette is dead. Jimmy Carter's alive. God bless him, still doing good deeds daily. The Republicans got where The Republicans got where they are in Arkansas today in large part on the Southern strategy, racial division, a black president, of course, helped them immensely in Arkansas and in turning the tables here. They've also won on that familiar platform of 3 Gs, gods, guns, and gays. 4, 2 of them against 1. Which brings me, again, back to moderation in a sense. I think that Denise Garner and all the moms demand candidates and people who support that group have found a great and righteous issue to rally around, the gun worship of the Arkansas legislature, and particularly Shotgun Charlie Collins and his campus legislation. But the gun lobby is powerful. Its adherents are motivated. I think it's smart to talk about common sense gun safety, but it won't prevent the opposition from depicting you as a gun confiscator or something worse. I guess what I'm saying is I'm not sure it's a winning issue alone, and it certainly has the potential to motivate voters on both sides, just as many people here are motivated by that issue, so are a lot of people on the NRA side. There are a lot of important issues we can talk about in election races. What I don't know is which of them have potential for exciting voters. That's always the problem. State spending is probably the biggest single important issue facing anybody who lives in Arkansas today. Asa Hutchinson is a pretty canny political operator. He's no moderate, but he manages to give an impression of being one, sometimes to credulous columnists, not to me. He's slowly strangling the state budget. He hasn't set out on a slash and burn budget, as some governors in some other states, Sam Brown back in Kansas, have done. But we're shorting the state in every single way. Every year for the last 3 years, the legislature has approved less in increased spending for public education than the legislative staff has recommended was necessary to meet the sufficiency standard of the state Supreme Court's Lakeview decision. Now, this is a lot of gobbledygook, but what it boils down to is we're not putting enough money in our public schools. Whether anybody cares. Whether anybody cares is the question. Whether you can make an issue of that is the question. Each legislature falls short. Governor Hutchinson just fired his probation and parole director, not for any misdeeds or scandal, but because she wanted to hire some more probation and parole officers. We've had an intensive study of the need for more probation and parole officers as part of a criminal justice reform effort, and he simply does not want to spend any more money on probation and parole officers because he wants to cut taxes more, and so he's cutting every facet of state government, from the pitiful little Department of Heritage to state police, to make money available so he can have another tax cut. If they do knock off a percentage point on the top bracket of the state income tax bracket, it'll be an enormous boon to the extraordinary rich. The figures show that the percentage that would be benefited by a very small number of people would knock your eyes out. And in fact, a lot of that windfall would be realized in a corridor of the state running from about Greenland up to the Missouri border, I think, in fact. But we know from evidence, locally and nationally, that it won't grow industry, it won't create jobs, and it won't enhance public infrastructure or services. We're already ranked number 1 or number 2 in both the cost of living and the cost of doing business, and yet rather than making this a more attractive place in an aesthetic and infrastructure and cultural and educational ways, we want to cut taxes some more. I think the biggest corporate titans in America know what's valuable, more so than we seem to indicate ourselves. Investing in people is a lot more important than just investing in rich people's tax cuts. Well, the state is also slowly decreasing support to higher education. When you read that, well, they gave a few more dollars in the last legislative session to higher education, what you miss is the steady decline in percentage of the amount of universities that are supported by state money. We're slowly strangling the universities from the state level. The med school is a particular victim of this. We opened the second med school in Northwest Arkansas to satisfy the rich folks up here who wanted one, and we can't support the one we've got in Little Rock. Well, the students will pay more, tuition is going up, and so there is that. Now, we do help higher education if you're a Bible college in Springdale, Arkansas. And if you're from Texas, Plano, Texas will give you a scholarship to the University of Arkansas to upgrade too. So there is that. We have some respect for higher education. Anyway, well, I'd like to see more of a movement in Arkansas in support of public education that we've seen in some other states. There's been some real backlash to get a movement for higher teacher pay in some states. Some strikes have proved beneficial. At this point, we're not quite there yet in Arkansas. I'm not sure why. Part of the reason is I think there's been a really successful effort by Republicans and some of the very wealthy people in the state, the Billionaire Boys Club, I call them, to diminish public education. What had once been the nation's hallmark is now viewed suspiciously and somehow a failure. And again, it tends to fall along racial lines. It's a very easy thing to do, to demonize public schools using Little Rock and its majority black enrollment as a sign of what's wrong with publication, when in fact what the Little Rock schools illustrate is how deeply damaging poverty is to achievement in education, whether it's in Little Rock or any place else. But just be aware, if you've not seen much of the charter, voucher, homeschooling movement yet, you've seen a little up here, you'll see more. That movement is growing, it's not going away. Ethics in government is another potential topic of electioneering. I've always thought it was a great topic, but it doesn't seem like it's ever been much of a vote mover, oddly enough. Perhaps we just expect our politicians to be crooked, and so if they live up to our expectations, so what? It doesn't really matter. However, this year it seems a particularly rich field. We've had 5 state legislators plead guilty or be convicted of public corruption, stealing money from the state treasury. 2 more have been directly implicated in taking bribes. I don't think there's any doubt that the actual extent of corruption, if not in a strictly legal sense and a moral sense, is much bigger than we had any idea at this point because of the stink that came from the parceling out of the General Improvement Fund money. And so perhaps that's something that could be useful in political campaigns. I don't know. I mean, there are Democrats and Republicans on both sides of that corruption. It doesn't boil down strictly to a Republican problem, although I think when they got their shot at the pig trough, they really hunkered down on it. There's no much doubt about that. So, I think we could talk about open government. I think we could talk about televising all webcasting all government meetings in both the Senate and the House. We've made some strides in campaign finance disclosure, but if any of you use the new online system, it's got some bugs. It's not where it needs to be. We could do a whole lot more on that, but it's a step in the right direction. Being able to cross-check who's giving money to whom and knowing where support's coming from is a very valuable thing in politics. There's the environment. It's a huge issue in Arkansas, and it ought to be a winner. Most people are green. You know, most people in Arkansas hunt and fish. And that's an environmental issue, and yet somehow we're content with an Attorney General who spent her first term in office trying to tear down environmental regulations. Nobody seems to want to touch the Buffalo River much. It seems to be held harmless, but there's an awful lot of harm being done to streams all over Arkansas by the policies being pursued by our Environmental Quality Agency and the Commission. You know, we haven't enforced we're the only state in the country that haven't complied with the Clean Water Law. We've held off for like 40 years on it, and somehow nobody seems to care. So the environment, perhaps that would be an issue. Then there is criminal justice reform. I think, unfortunately, too many people, prosecutors in the state particularly, the idea of criminal justice reform is making prison sentences longer and keeping them locked up longer. It's an incredibly expensive proposition. We clearly lock up too many people. But rehabilitative, restorative justice is expensive too. It can't be done without transitional programs, without probation, parole officers. I don't begin to kid ourselves that we save money by moving to a transitional restorative justice system, because if it's done right, it's not cheap either. Government just isn't cheap. By the way, I don't think our prisons are packed with marijuana offenders. That's an easy thing to say, but the figures don't really support it very much. There are some people who go to prison for simple marijuana offenses, but they generally are related to other ancillary crimes. I do think marijuana is a good issue. I think the polls show and the voting shows that people want legal marijuana in Arkansas. They clearly want legal medical marijuana, and the state has just made a disaster of putting the regulations into effect. 2 years after voting, we won't be anywhere near being able to access legal medical marijuana in November this year, and somebody ought to be held accountable for that, and if not the Hutchinson administration. Finally, on potential voter issues that are worth considering this year, I think are the ballot issues. First is issue 1. This is an abomination. This is the so-called tort reform amendment. It's the thing to put a limit on damages and damage suits and a limit on attorney's fees. But even when it takes away your right to a jury trial, it's caused terrible hardships. It's ruined the nursing homes in Texas because they know they can't be sued anymore, so they don't care about quality care any longer. But the worst thing about it is that it turns over court rules to this Arkansas legislature. And if you can't beat this issue with a 30-second ad that shows Mike Neal, John Woods, Jake Files, Henry Wilkins, and Eddie Cooper with little inmate numbers on their neck and say, give these guys control of the courts? These guys? Then we're lost for sure if that doesn't work. But they're going to spend something like $6 million on the other side, and it's going to be tough. There's vote suppression. I don't think there'll be much of a campaign on either side of this issue, the voter ID amendment. It'll probably pass because people have bought the bogus argument that there's wholesale voter identification falsification at the polls. There's not. This is about vote suppression, pure and simple, and it very literally may have produced the presidency of Donald Trump. 3 states, 77,000 votes, swung electoral votes in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania to Donald Trump. Those are all 3 states where voter ID laws are put in effect by Republicans and Republican courts that upheld them, and they work. In Milwaukee alone, tens of thousands of poor black people were denied the ballot because they didn't have voter ID, and I don't think they would have been voting for Donald Trump if they could have gotten their votes counted. have a minimum wage proposal. That's a good populist proposal. Populist meaning something that appeals to the common guy. The Chamber of Commerce will oppose it, of course, and they'll use people employed by our tax money, thanks to a John Wood constitutional amendment, to fight it. Speaking of felons. And I don't know, it should pass. It's to take the wage up from $8.50 to $11 an hour over a 4-year period of time. It seems reasonable to me. But there's something in Arkansas. We're a right-to-work state after all. We sometimes seem a curious elevation in punishing ourselves. I don't quite understand that. And then there's term limits. You know, the term limits amendment looks like it will be back, and it's to roll back a little bit of what the felon John Woods took away from us with his so-called ethics amendment. You know, they upped the time to 16 years in either house, and that was a really significant change because you could pile up 16 years in a single house of the legislature, enough time to accrue enormous power through seniority and being there. And in fact, the way the Senate works, because they draw for 2 years terms that don't count after censuses, it's created a situation where we could have Jason Raper as a senator for 22 years. I used to be against term limits. I'm rethinking. If it'll send Jason Raper home. And then there's casino gambling, and I don't know. I think that it looks like the people with the money in that issue have reached an accommodation, so there probably is going to be a big campaign on this. And so maybe we'll have more casinos. Unfortunately, it'll produce more tax money that'll probably go to a bad use, to a tax cut rather than to constructive purposes. But that'll be up to the legislature. I guess if there's a moral on all this, I'm saying that I'm not sure a candidate can win on guns alone, but I'm not sure where to turn, really, for the best alternative. I wish I could say, for example, it was abortion rights or gay rights. But the Arkansas poll, which I think has turned out to be a pretty reliable predictor every year, says the state is about split on abortion rights. On gay rights is still, sadly, pretty much not ready to accept equality for gay people. I think it goes back to some of our religious tradition, which also shows in our divorce rates and our extramarital conduct and other things, with child neglect and other things. But anyway, you know where I'm coming from. But if this were a Republican meeting, I'd just say God, guns, gays, cut taxes, and go to the House. And Democrats are not so easily herded. They're a little more nuanced. They have different ideas. And that's a great thing, but it's a complication politically. And this is played out at the federal level. We've got some, I just really admire, like, all of the people who stepped forward to run for Congress this year. Hayden Schammel, Chinton Desai, Clark Tucker, Josh Mahoney, and they're running hard, and I wish them well. But I mean, I think, honestly speaking, the only one likely with a chance is Clark Tucker, and he will have to come up with some way to overcome the suburban red tide that surrounds Pulaski County. There's hope that the Little Rock mayor's race and some of these ballot issues might inspire a larger than normal black turnout in Pulaski County in an off presidential year when black vote is traditionally smaller, that might build his margin in Pulaski sufficiently to give him enough room to win the district. But it'd have to be a perfect storm, I think. This is depressing to me. Every morning I wake up and I realize Donald Trump is president, and it's not a nightmare, it's reality. And the worst thing, again, back to remember that you don't live alone in this world. 40% of the people, poll after poll, say are happy with him, approve of the job he's doing, and aren't bothered by his misstatements and his lies and his buffoonery, but they just like a guy who will say anything. And that's, I'd rather have a more thoughtful president, but that's me. So, we can't win if we don't run. This group illustrates that well, that people are running. We need more candidates in 2020. Good job this year, but it's not enough. We need to field somebody in every single race on the ballot. The Democratic Party needs to reduce its filing fees. They discourage candidates. We must resist, and we must, to do that, we've got to vote. And we've got to figure out a way to get young people to the polls. If you know one, pester them until you know they voted, because we we can't afford a low turnout. The good news is people my age are dying off. Sorry, the rest of you are out there. But I did see today, finally, there was a poll that found 51% of people over 65 were embarrassed that Donald Trump was president. Maybe enough of them that may not be wisdom, they just may be dead. I don't know. But whatever, it's moving in the right direction. But I'm really happy to look at, and with all due respect to the good men candidates are out there, I mean, I think women are the answer. I think it's time for women to step I'm going to buy a shirt before I leave. The list from Northwest Arkansas, from Siloam Springs to Fayetteville: Lou Sharp, Jane Agnew, Jan Gilreath, Kate McFarland, Megan Godfrey, Denise Garner, Nicole Clowney, Celeste Williams, Kelly Hunter, Christy Craig. What a lineup. So for somebody who's pretty negative, I grant you, that is something to be happy about. And I think at that point, I don't know if y'all do questions, I'll take some or whatever, but thank you and happy.
It appears that Congress is set to cut about $1.5 trillion from Medicaid, quite a lot from Medicare and Social Security. They're dying to do this. But I don't hear many people talk about that complex issue of elder care, speaking of those of us with one leg out the door. I think that's an issue that could be useful to the Democrats to get older people who will vote to begin to, can you speak?
I think